So, welcome to SBC Podcast, episode number 3. Today with us, we have Paul Huszar of Vetcor, and we will talk about hiring in general, him being a veteran and being an entrepreneur. And in general, we'll talk about hiring, but specifically, we'll also talk about hiring veterans and some do's and some don'ts altogether about hiring. Paul, welcome to SBC Podcast.
Well, thank you, Rashid. It is my absolute pleasure to be here, and I really appreciate you doing this for, in general, the business community, but also specifically inviting me to come and talk about the value in hiring veterans.
Yeah, awesome. So, Paul, can you tell people just a little bit about you, your background, and then VetCor as well?
Sure. So I am a retired Army officer. I graduated from West Point in 1990 and then spent 23 years on active duty, loved every minute of it. Retired and moved to Tampa about 4 years ago. On active duty, I was a combat engineer officer, and I earned my professional engineering degree. I had the privilege and honor of commanding about 1,000 soldier and airman joint task force in Iraq in 2009-10. And then my terminal assignment on active duty, I was the dean of the Army's engineer school. And that really formed a lot of the things in my impressions and why I'm here today. And we'll talk a little bit about that later. Right. And so I retired 4 years ago, moved to Tampa. Why not? Because I love this area. My wife's family is from here. And so we set up our criteria, and we found that for the first time in my life, we could find all of our criteria instead of, picking the best of a worst course of action near some less than desirable, perhaps, military town. And so we moved here, and then I got really depressed because I couldn't find the opportunities that I thought I would be able to find as a licensed professional engineer with a master's degree, in my resume. And then through this odd series of networking events, I got connected with a gentleman named David Howard, who now is my business partner, but at the time was the CEO of a forensics engineering company. Given my professional engineering background, that's how he got connected with me. But he had also been a veteran for 5 years, and then spent 25 years in the insurance industry. And then we had the opportunity. He hired me to start a restoration company. His idea was to call it Vetcor with the differentiator. I like the name, by the way. I love the name. With the differentiator of hiring veterans as our service technicians. And given my background coming right from active duty, my own personal struggles in finding opportunities, and then the experience I mentioned as the dean of the Army Engineer School, that became my passion. And so I was hired in December of 2013 to start the company from scratch as the first employee and president. Right. About 8 months later, I had the opportunity to buy the company, and we've just grown substantially since then.
Yeah. Well, congratulations on that. And you mentioned the dean of engineering.
Yes.
And can you tell us a little bit on what that entails?
Sure. So my official title was the Director of Training and Leader Development. But as I explained to people, if I told you that was my title, most people wouldn't understand what that was. And that's one of the challenges that veterans experience transitioning to civilian life.
Right.
Well, so I explain it that my counterpart at the Air Force Civil Engineering School, and the Air Force is the youngest service, right? So they're the closest to being civilians. We laugh and kid them. Well, my counterparts at the Air Force Engineering School his title was the dean. So I just tell everybody that was my title, because essentially that was a more equivalent civilian duty description. But in the Army, engineers are a variety, about 12 military occupational specialties. Plumbers, carpenters, electricians, firefighters, divers, heavy equipment operators, map makers, surveyors, well drillers. There's a few more.
Wow, that's a lot of specialties.
Yeah, and so very construction, engineering, combat engineers, bridge crew members, those types of things. Right. So one would think that generally those types of occupational specialties wouldn't have a challenge when they got out of the military, right? Because they're all very marketable skills.
Yeah, you'd hope so, right?
Well, part of the challenge I had discovered was that when we trained them at the Army's Engineer School at Fort Leonard Wood, Missouri, and other satellite locations, and then sent them off to Fort Bragg, North Carolina, Fort Hood, Texas, Fort Lewis, Washington, and by the way, all 50 states in the Union, because we trained the Army's National Guard as well. Guess which credential they got to be a plumber, a carpenter, electrician?
Yeah.
And the answer is none. Because essentially the credentialing for those occupational specialties resides at the state level. And have you ever tried to get 50 different states to agree on anything?
Good luck with that, right?
So I had discovered that was an unsolvable problem, and that's part of the challenge that most people don't understand and don't think about. Is you can have a guy who spent a 20-year career in the military as a carpenter or construction specialist, and then they transition out, and their resume has the experience, but they don't have the equivalent civilian credential.
So, what have you found, like some of the things people should keep in mind, like hiring in general,
Yep.
and selecting, and then in particular, like when it comes to veterans?
Sure. There's several things. Well, first of all, I think hiring and selecting talent is probably the most important thing that we do.
Right, I agree.
Because everything flows from there, right?
Right.
And they'll take your dreams and make them into reality.
Right.
If they're well led and provided a vision, they'll help that vision come true. I think in general, though, and I think veterans are a very good choice to do those types of things. They're very team oriented. They have a values base. They have a lot of skill sets. And those are the things that people typically understand, but there are a lot of things that they don't understand.
Right.
For example, they're lifelong learners. They're used to changing jobs and physical locations every 3 to 4 years. And in my case, I can't remember how many duty stations, but I went from being commanding one of the Army's 2 airborne combat engineer battalions, which was one of the greatest jobs in the Army as an engineer officer, to being the dean of the engineer school. Those 2 jobs couldn't be farther apart.
Yeah.
But that's what the Army expected me to do, and I was able to learn. And so it promotes this culture of lifelong learning, particularly in an up or out society, which is the military.
That's an interesting point, because we always think of like discipline, and then a lot of people just think automatically rigid rules and things like that. But that's a very interesting point.
And I would add, I think some of the best leaders I've ever met have been in the military. And because we're so disconnected from society, less than 0.5% of the population actively serves in the military today. It's the smallest it's ever been in our nation's history. We should be very proud of that, though.
Yeah.
We're the most powerful nation on the face of the earth,
Right.
But we're doing it with the least amount of our national treasure at risk. So that's great news. But the reality is, as a result of that, fewer and fewer people know someone in the military, a cousin, a neighbor, or whatever.
Right.
And so we become disconnected. So what we see is Hollywood, generally.
Right.
And so there's this notion that people follow rote orders and autocratic leadership and all this stuff. And that's not the military at all.
Yeah.
It's all about the opportunities, seizing the initiative, exercising good judgment and initiative. And the U.S. military has been known for that. So I think that's one kind of false, I guess, impression that many people have.
Yeah, misconceptions.
Yep.
Yeah.
The other thing is when you wear a uniform, camouflage, battle dress uniform or whatever, I think people, if you're in the Air Force, people tend to think of you as a fighter pilot. If you're in the Army, people tend to think of you as an infantryman, or you drove tanks or fired artillery, a fighter. You break things, right? Navy, you're in a sub or ship or F-18 or F-14s or F-16s or whatever. But the reality is there's this thing called the tooth to tail ratio. The tooth, the bitey end, right, of the military is about 30% of the fighting force. The rest of the 70% are the plumbers, carpenters, electricians, logisticians, maintainers, mailmen, medics, all these things, which are very remarkable.
Right.
And even the combat specialties, I think most people would find is that those folks have a tremendous amount of leadership and management experience that far exceeds in general their civilian peers, because they've been given so much responsibility at an early age. So even they have marketable skills to offer.
Yeah, and I think was it Jocko Willink who said like discipline equals freedom. And,
That's right.
Right. I think that there's a lot of times people just think freedom is just doing whatever you want or what things like that. And discipline is not necessarily a bad thing, because a lot of times it actually what gives you the freedom to do certain things. And then also I've had the honor and pleasure to listen to some retired generals speak about their experience, leading teams, and it was very enlightening as far as like the level of communication back and forth that happens, because people think that people are just shouting orders at each other, but there were a lot of nuggets for me as far as leadership in general.
Yeah, I think you mentioned discipline. There's several things with respect to that. I think the easy thing to think about is discipline in thought and action, personal self-discipline, and those are all great characteristics to have. But I think some things that are often overlooked, and this is why I seize these opportunities, is there's discipline in thought and organization. So,
Right.
for example, making organization out of chaos. That's
Right.
what the military does.
Yeah.
There's a German general officer that was quoted after post-World War II debriefing, and the famous quote is that war is chaos, and the reason the American Army succeeds so well is that they practice chaos on a daily basis, right? But they make organization out of chaos.
Right.
And one of the ways they do that is we have what's called recipes for success. It's another attribute of generally veterans.
Right.
So veterans are used to things like after action reviews and AAR.
Right.
After every time you do something, you figure out what happened,
Right.
why did it happen,
Yeah.
how we can improve.
Right.
So you talk about lifelong learning, and
Right.
imagine if every
Yeah.
project that you did, every task that you did in
Yeah.
the company, wouldn't you like to have that attribute?
Right.
of
Yeah.
What
learn
happened,
from
why it happened,
those
how can we
lessons.
improve?
And
Right.
then pass them on as well is the other important aspect, because I think when you do that, then you're able to document them and you're able to improve, but you're also able to kind of carry on that wisdom as it goes down the line, and then other people can improve on it, and there is that continuity.
Yeah,
which
the
is-
organization continues to improve, right?
Right.
And you and I know as business owners, we want that.
Right.
But it also leads to personal improvement too. So as personal, and then you invest in your employees,
Right.
and they continue to improve personally and professionally, and your organization succeed. Imagine the great possibilities.
Yeah.
So it's one of the things I think is often overlooked. I could name probably 10 other types of recipes for success that have been instilled in me as a military officer and a combat engineer, and all of the discipline and thought that have allowed me. I was just using one today, as a matter of fact. CCIR, Commander's Critical Information Requirements. So I've developed this sheet that is all of the things that I want to know as the CEO of the company.
Right.
And I say, look, everybody in the company needs to know that if one of these things happen, potential damage to the company's reputation,
Right.
because we screw something up, I need to know about that immediately. If an employee gets in a vehicle accident,
Right.
well, I need to know about that, but that one can come up through the chain of command.
Right.
That's a recipe for success that I learned in the military.
Right.
And I'd be happy to share those with
Yeah.
you or anybody else,
Yeah.
because I think there's some really great tools out there that create disciplined organization out of chaos.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm glad you bring that up. Eventually, we would like to give people an opportunity at the end to get your contact information as
Absolutely.
well, to be in touch with you, and then if there is any things like they want to ask you, or things they wanna get from you. But Paul, what are some of the things people should keep in mind if they're interviewing veterans, or if they're considering veterans, or if
Well, thank you for that question, because it's one of my favorite questions to answer.
Yeah.
So I try and explain it like this. For me, as an example, I graduated from high school at 18, and I went to West Point. 4 years at West Point, and then 23 years in the Army. So 27 years of my life, really my whole adult life, until I retired from the Army. Right. And whether it's someone like me, or let's say an 18-year-old who graduated from high school and spent 4 years on active duty and is now getting out looking for a job. Whatever it is, people like them or people like me, just remember, we've spent all our adult life being formed by the cultures, norms, and values of the U.S. military.
Right.
And oh, by the way, Uncle Sam told me where to go, what to do. I never had to interview for a job. I never had to create a resume. And it's been all about the team. So when I talk to other fellow business owners, they say, well, that's the kind of people we want on our team, the selfless servants, the people team oriented. I said, but here's the challenge. Let's talk about how we interview and how we select people. Right? We have this one-page piece of paper front and back called a resume.
Right.
And if we're intellectually honest, what's a resume? Really, that piece of paper where Paul tells Rashid how great Paul is and why Rashid should hire him on his team. Right? How comfortable do you think I am at doing that when I've spent all my life about the team and I've never had to do a resume?
Right.
And there's all the associated words and translational challenges and those things, and the credentialing challenges I mentioned, right? So, okay, but let's say that I've learned how to write a resume, and you say, okay, well, it's not the best resume I've ever seen, but Paul, come on in for an interview.
Right.
Now, we've met before, and I think you know now that I am extroverted to the extreme, so I'm very comfortable in this environment. But most folks aren't.
Right.
And so what's an interview if we're intellectually honest? Maybe 15 minutes or so for me to tell you how great I am and why you should hire me on the team. So again, it comes back to how comfortable do you think a veteran is when they've spent all their adult life being invested in an institution,
Right.
not in themselves, and have zero experience in resume writing, zero experience in interviewing?
Yeah, they've been putting others before self. And,
That's right.
Yeah, right.
And when we think about our system of how we hire, it's not designed that way.
Right.
It's basically personal self-marketing, right? And I understand that.
Right, yeah.
So to the folks out there listening in, just understand that there are so many layers and so much more to the veteran. So if you see their first resume or they don't interview well, perhaps give them a second chance and understand that, man, it's counter to the culture that
You're
they've
not
been
hiring them
raised.
to interview. You're hiring them to do
That's
a job.
right.
Because
That's
there
right.
are people who are great at interviewing, but then you bring them into your organization and they're a dud. So,
Yep.
right, just because someone can interview well doesn't always guarantee. So,
That's right. And those that don't necessarily interview that well or
Right.
haven't had that very
Yes.
polished resume
Yeah.
can make some of the best teammates.
Yeah. Agreed. So Paul, we could go on all day talking about this. The deeper we get into it, the more we can talk about. But I did want to give you, I did want to ask you this: is there something that maybe you want to share that maybe hasn't come up yet in the conversation, or maybe a call to action, or anything that you think our listeners should keep in mind, or
Sure.
read?
I think today, as I mentioned, how kind of segregated and maybe uninformed, but not intentionally uninformed. I mean, we have this great life in the United States, and our veterans have served to protect and defend our culture, our way of life, right? And so I think sometimes that some of that's taken for granted. And because the veteran population is so small, only about, depending on how you calculate, only about 10% of the population have ever served. Less than 0.5% currently serve in uniform now, but when you look in aggregate, only about 10%. So because we're so segmented in society, I think there are some stigmas that get attached to veterans that don't necessarily belong there. One is the homeless vet. There's a challenge, but it's not necessarily the stigma that should be attached. The other is post-traumatic stress and traumatic brain injury. Those are definitely problems, but anybody can have post-traumatic stress as a result of a car accident, a traumatic experience. So I think those things are often overplayed. And compared to the tremendous value that they potentially bring to your team. But if you bring them to your team, just recognize they've been in a different culture, in a different world.
Right.
They're looking for some standards. They're looking for some SOPs, some documentation. Where's the field manual to show me how to do this?
Right.
And so they can, if you bring them on, sometimes they can get frustrated with that. So you've got to do some work to help them with their culture and integrating into your new culture in the civilian world as well. Maybe there's some things that you can learn about the military culture, some of the recipes for success that may help your team grow.
Yes.
So I just think there's tremendous value out there in seeking them. There's no easy way, unfortunately, to find them. I'd be happy to connect with folks to help. I would like to believe there's an easy button, or you call the VA, but there's a tremendous amount of organizations out there trying to help. Unfortunately, there's not really a one-stop shop for that. U.S. Chamber of Commerce has Hire Our Heroes website. There's several organizations like that. But the reality is, if you're interested, connect with like a senior veteran in the area. And the Tampa Bay community is great for that. The Greater Tampa Chamber Military Affairs Committee, the South Tampa Chamber, the Brandon Chamber all have military affairs committees because they work well with MacDill. They can all help and get you connected with some of those organizations to bring some great talent on your team.
Awesome. All right. Well, Paul, it's been an honor and a pleasure to have you on the SBC podcast. And thank you for everything you do. Thank you for your service. And how can people get a hold of you?
Sure. Well, thanks, Rashid, for this tremendous opportunity. If you can tell, I'm pretty passionate about trying to create opportunities for veterans. People can reach me through my email address. It's first initial, last name. So H is in hotel, U is in uniform, S is in Sierra, Z is in Zulu, A is in Alpha, R is in Romeo. That's another recipe for success, the phonetic alphabet, at vetcorservices.com. And Vetcor is V is in Victor, E is in Echo, T is in Tango, C is in Charlie, O is in Oscar, R is in Romeo, with wordservices.com. And I'd be happy to help share some of these. I've got some white papers of how to tips for hiring veterans, things like that, and connect. And our website is vetcorservices.com. And any of those ways they can reach out and touch me.
Yeah, awesome. We'll also put some footnotes to accompany the link to the episode, where we can put the link to Paul's information as well. Well, this concludes our SBC podcast. Please be on the lookout for future episodes and feel free to check out any previous episodes. Thank you very much.